last talk of the day and of the symposium. Professor Stjepan Oreskovic, who is a professor of public health at the University of Zagreb School of Medicine, is also, as his title implies, a public health expert. And he's going to take us through public health as it relates, or he's going to take us through the UNESCO recommendation on the role of science as it relates to public health. So the exact title is Knowledge Starts, Knowledge Flows, Normative Rules and the Reality, UNESCO Recommendation on the Role of Science in National Policy and Decision-Making, International Cooperation and Development. Please, Stjepan.
Okay. So here is the presentation. So I hope I won't take you for too long. So the presentation is result of the many things. First, my participation in the previous meetings, both in New York and in Dubrovnik. It was a great opportunity to learn and listen, and I'm really glad that I joined this group. Thank you, Helle, because you know it's something I consider a area with the huge potential for change in our lives. And so then I was working together with Sebastian on chapter for your next book, and I will be using some of the slides that are results from this research. And then the most important and I would say stimulating thing was that actually the pandemic of SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 disease is, I think, that the biggest and the most interesting natural experiment, and science is not all but most of the time about experiments. And when we look what are the consequences of the pandemic, we see a huge changes in our lives, in our environment, in economy, in our behavior. And as far as I have inquired, almost every science is or has been pushed towards the edge of the existing knowledge. And not only experimental biology or virology or whichever biomedical science, because when we speak about pandemics, it's usually narrowed to only biomedical research, and that's what I will try to show and to prove how the not only particular sciences were pushed towards the edge, but also that the concept of science that we inherited would not bring the solution. So next slide, please. So first part, I would like to address the fundamentals. Next slide. And I think the fundamental text for our age is the letter or the article written by Immanuel Kant, and the title was "What is Enlightenment?" And my understanding is that we are in a way coming to the end of enlightenment, and it's kind of complete fulfillment of the idea of what he said is that persons, citizens should come out of the self-imposed tutelage. She called this also nuance, and then to have a courage to use the knowledge without a fear and with any guidance. And my hypothesis is that that's part of the problem, because what we see here as a result is problems with behavior that is related to idea that everyone knows everything, and that everything depends on our own understanding without being responsibly related to previous knowledge, to knowledge stocks we have, to other people, to institutions. So next slide, please. And so the other very important text is by John Dewey, who says that the solution would not be government by experts, in which the masses do not have chance to inform the experts on their needs, and so on. But basically what we have here sometimes is the situation where the governments are completely neglecting science institutions and knowledge stocks we have and acting without any guidance. The next slide. So the basic documents that are all influencing the idea of right to science is first Declaration of the Right of Man and Citizen from 1789 with the idea of freedom, Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and then International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and especially Article 15 of ESCR. What is kind of interesting footnote, when you look at the documents, especially the Declaration of the Right of Man and Citizen, and then a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you always see the women representing the declarations. Eleanor Roosevelt, and then the ladies with the flag, the French Revolution. Next slide, please. So we have heard a lot about Article 15, and I will later on try to connect the wording and messages of the Article 15 to concrete situation related to pandemic of COVID-19. Next slide. Next slide, please. So there is the idea that we live in a knowledge society, and that there is, and obviously we are witnessing a huge progress in scientific research. After the World War II, the large-scale projects started, and both from governmental side, from business side, and global corporations, and the role of organized knowledge in society, especially so-called STEM sciences, at the pedestal, and obviously they have a huge influence on how we live. We discussed part of this yesterday. Next slide. So the question is how we use the existing knowledge stocks, everything what we have as a knowledge, through the process which brings us to a position that we can interpret this properly and to give rise to the information society. Next slide. And then we can objectively measure the changes through the indexes such as Nature Science Index, and we can have a very evidence-based information about a quantity of the knowledge we are accumulating on the daily basis. And so, for example, IBM researchers estimate that 90% of the world's data has been created in the last 2 years. So it's a huge production of information. And the question is whether we can still speak about the knowledge itself. So the first time in the history of science, and including the history of data science itself, we are witnessing a paramount attempt to integrate all the existing possible sources of data, information, and knowledge to confront the single phenomena. And that's the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. Or at least I believe we should try to do so. The next slide. Next slide, please. So the phenomena we are facing with the science itself is, this is the famous book written by Kahneman about slow and fast thinking, system 1 and system 2. The book is very interesting and influential. At the end, he got a Nobel Prize for these studies, which shows that we work through two systems which are interconnected. One would be intuitional, and the second one would be the rational. But what we are facing now with the huge production of research related to COVID pandemic is sometimes demonstration of impulsive, not well thought publishing and also information. The next slide. And even before the pandemic, we had a problem of so-called crisis of science, because what you can see here at this research and the graphs, there are many studies, especially in certain areas of biomedicine, psychology, and so on, where people are publishing the studies, which would be quantitative studies, and then when we want to reproduce in the same conditions, they fail to reproduce. We simply cannot get the same data. So it's not a science. And it's a huge amount of what we would call a science is not reproducible. The next slide. And so in that case, we speak about science, but we cannot follow the rules and the methods that we use to produce the scientific results. And next slide. And then we definitely can speak about incomplete or incorrect data that are presented like correct and scientific data or sources. And my understanding is there is a huge evidence that especially during the epidemics, there is a huge production of information that are sometimes presented as a scientific work, but actually without possibility to reproduce or even to prove how the results were achieved. The next slide. So the previous part was story about how science inflects itself, how the science is losing credibility because scientists tend to present the results which were not methodologically mature or credible as a scientific fact. And then also, in addition to this, sometimes there is a tendency that science presents itself as a religion, meaning that whatever is product of science is a final truth, and then even that it couldn't be questioned. But actually the nature of science is actually questioning everything, and whatever we achieve is only a milestone at the long way. And then the problem with such a situation is that when we have this populist logic and the interests of political interests combined with economic interests, and then we lose the credibility of the science, we have a huge problem with society. The next one. So there are books and articles that are describing this new situation as a coronavirus capitalism, because the idea is that virus has affected societies and all segments of society, including science, healthcare, education, and politics, in such a profound way that we really have a kind of new ideology, a surveillance capitalism, which is creating the new tools for the total control of the society using new technologies and methods for the surveillance. The next slide, please. There are, of course, huge differences in how different governments are addressing these problems. I would say EU Commission recommendations were on the positive side of the story because there is always a challenge how to trace the infected people, how to trace the spots and super spreaders, and at the same time not endanger freedom of individuals. The next slide, please. Of course, there is on the other side a very well-known story about conspiracy theories, and they are really super spreading like a virus around the world. And the four major conspiracy theories coming from the top of the governments is, whether we speak about US, China, Europe, is first that virus escaped from Chinese laboratory in Wuhan. We have heard this so many times, and we have seen a very credible scientific publications that are proving and showing that this is not the case. And then that was many times coming from US. And then there is a Chinese response saying that the US military brought the virus to Wuhan. And then there is a 5G network spreading the virus. And then there is a story about Bill Gates and crazy things about his, although the person is contributing a lot to health of global health. Next slide, please. And there is fortunately a good evidence and empirical research on how many stories have been distributed and from where they are originating, and the research shows that basically one of the main sources of misinformation is President of the United States. Next slide, please. So we do not have only pandemic, but we have infodemic, where the spread of the fake, incorrect, unscientific theories and news and explanations about almost everything what's going on is almost equally strong as the news that were spread from relevant scientific sources. Next slide. But you know, the consequences are dire, and basically there is a large population in almost every country, although this is also interesting to take a look in, that simply do not want to see, hear, and anything what does not fit inside the predefined conspiracy theories. Although it's not completely correct, this picture, because Mizaro and Kikazaro is not seeing, not hearing, maybe works, but they talk a lot. Next slide. So when we come to our point and our topic, I together with Sebastian, we selected several, I would say many articles from the ECSCR that are directly related to the existing situation. Like Article 2.2, here you can see paragraph 25, that state parties under immediate obligation to eliminate forms of discrimination against individuals and groups in the enjoyment of ECCSR. Basically, when we compare the declaration with existing concrete circumstances and go country by country, we can go to the next slide also. Like state party must take steps to maximum of their available resources, full realization of the right to science and so on. We can see the next slide that basically the countries, the governments that were not willing to follow any rules on science and right to science were directly punished by the highest level of infection cases, death rates, and their consequences of pandemic. And what is really interesting with this pandemic with this disease is that it's completely unacceptable and outside of any scenario. Because if you compare the countries with highest casualties, the highest death rates, with the rankings of the best healthcare system or the most wealthiest countries in the world, you would see that you would find the countries with highest level of casualties having the best healthcare systems, the best science, and the most of the resources. So the answer why they are suffering so much is directly connected to rejection of the rules on the behavior that are defined in the declaration. Next slide, please. The calculation we did trying to compare countries with the highest and the lowest infection rates, transmission rates, death rates, and diagnostic rate, the number of people going through diagnostics, we find out this is the picture, and then putting into the model the level of wealth. You see the country which is the most efficient in the world is Vietnam. They have over 100 million population and they have 35 deaths so far. While countries like US, France, and others, they have enormous resources available to fight pandemic, have horrible results. Next slide. So I said yesterday I was reading the report from the Congress majority on digital monopoly. Today, this morning, I was reading New England Journal of Medicine because it's highly unusual what they did. They never did this before. They wrote an editorial saying that basically the existing government is destroying institutions and all principles of science and putting the nation in peril, and that basically the consequence is that number of people affected or deaths are 2,000 times higher than in Vietnam. And if there would be an article interesting for our idea of right to science, I would say this one is probably the milestone, because they describe, this is the journal with highest impact factor in the world, they describe in the article point by point which scientific principles and institutions that are functioning based on science were under attack with the idea to take over any kind of credibility from the institutions. Next slide. So when you take a look into the result, you will see what happens when you discredit the science and destroy scientific institutions and healthcare institutions that are functioning on the evidence-based medicine, you see that United States accounts for less than 5% of the world population, but have 20.1% of deaths and 21.1, 7.5 million of cases. Next slide. And then when you go within the structure of the population, you will see that who is suffering most is Black and Latino, poor people at the front lines of fighting with epidemics. And it's the same story in US, in UK, and interesting in Brazil. And what connects these three countries is a high level of populist politics and very avert relation to science and evidence. Next slide. And then, you know, when we go back to Article 15.4 of the ECSCR, which states that the states party to the present covenant recognize the benefits to be derived from the encouragement and development of international contacts and cooperation. But what you see here is that international cooperation does not work. And you can't find a global phenomenon like pandemic without global cooperation. And cooperation is one of the basic principles of science. And I must come back here to Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, which is usually wrong interpreted because it's defined like origin of species of natural selection, described as a permanent and ongoing fight. But basically what he says is that the most intelligent species are those which are able to collaborate. And the question of whether we can collaborate scientifically, socially, institutionally, not destroy international infrastructure, United Nations, WHO is really the key question. Next slide. This is the list that Human Rights Watch has developed, 40 questions. And when you go country by country and ask, trying to see how they reacted to these 40 questions, you will see that then every week group has been suffering from the pandemic. Next slide. And now the last part is how we can advocate for right to science, what we can do. And I have selected 5 areas. I refer here to the very interesting book of Nick Christakis. The title is The Evolutionary Origins of Good Society, and very interesting reading that shows exactly what I said before, that basically the science in the history was always focused on the dark side of human behavior and biological heritage, and that we do not invest enough into interest for positive, good, collaborative, and so on. But that we have capacity for doing so. Next slide. So when we talk about right to science, we may put too much stress on individual rights or too much stress on common good. And what we have when we talk about pandemic at the moment is exactly how to find the right measure between individual rights and common good. And when we discuss wearing masks, it's exactly what's on the table. Next slide. So inquiry is a constitutional element of human flourishing, and we should be very much open for inquiry into anything what's going on and happening. Next slide. So how the change towards the implementation of the principles of right of science could happen. That's always, you know, for me, the most interesting part, what we can do and how we can act to make things better. And I think there are 5 areas. One is new concepts and ideas, then new sciences and technologies, social actions, legal frameworks, and nudge for science. And I think there should be an attempt to put all these 5 areas together in kind of synchronized attempt. Next slide. New ideas and concepts. For example, I have selected an excellent article from a Stanford University group of researchers modeling anti-vaccine sentiment as a cultural pathogen. Everyone is talking and expecting a miraculous vaccine. And so there is a feeling like once we will have vaccine, everything will be over and all problems will be gone. But basically nothing will be resolved that moment because we have several problems with availability, with quality of vaccines, with people's behavior, with anti-vaccine sentiments, and they put all these together into one model to show that basically the same way the pathogen spreads in the society, the same way we have this spread of anti-vaccine sentiment. And if you have more than 50% of the people that would reject vaccine, and now there are many reasons why they would do so, and sometimes it's not just because people are crazy, it's also because science and pharmaceutical industry and many states are corrupted. There were many cases when people were vaccinated and vaccines were dangerous, or just because of the business, or creating panic because they sometimes want to make money. But the people from Stanford put all this information in one model, and I think that's the only way we should work as a science. Next slide. This is the result of their calculation, and the reality will work like this, because we cannot just go on for technological solution, in that case, vaccine, and then everything is over. It won't be. Next slide. So the next one is new technologies and broad distribution of scientific information. That's really very important, and that's part of the declaration. Article 15.2. Next slide. Next slide, please. So when we put into the frame of what is credible, what is potential, what is real, we see here there are 22 coronavirus treatment for effectiveness and safety, and we see that in public communication we have, for example, 2 methods which are widely used and safe. We have promising 13 that are underway, but we have also 3 that are highly dangerous and completely not scientific based. And all of them are in the communication in the public space treated almost equally. Next slide. So the next thing we can do for right to science is social action, because if we only speak about normative documents or declarations, their history shows that life does not change, reality does not change institution without the social action. And we should understand how people behave and what affects their decision to accept new ideas. Next slide. Like it was in the French Revolution, first you had the idea, then you had the social action, and then you had the document. Next slide. So the article the group you probably recognize here, published is what and how can we contribute to the idea. Next slide. There are a lot of researches like Eurobarometer, Gallup, asking scientists around the world, are they prepared to get involved in the social actions for the right to science? And I must say, if we look into the data, we would come to a conclusion that there are much more people saying that they are prepared to participate than what we see in reality. Next slide. And this is my favorite one, because even those who really need hardly to drink beer, they should understand that there is no beer without science also. Next slide. Next slide. And then, of course, at the end, we also need new legal frameworks and justification, normative for public engagement. And that's part about which we talk most. Next slide. And then there is a danger then that instead of having democracy, we will have judeocracy. Because if courts are taking place of the Congress or the parliaments and making decisions which are not problem of the legal functioning or the documents, but of the people's will or interest, we will come to the next problem. Next slide. And that's really the last part. One of the methods is, next slide please, is nudging for science. There is a famous and very good book written by Cass Sunstein, next one, which really addresses the idea of nudging for health, but I was trying to select all the instruments, methods, and processes that were applied to changing human behavior in healthcare, and to think how we can use the same approach for science. Next slide. And then we should always ask ourselves, if there will be a right to science, what would be the right to? And I think this is very important, because science itself is not good or bad, it's neutral. It's a question how we use the result. Next slide. So, thank you so much.